Okay, guys, I apologize if y'all saw or didn't see or wanted to see the video I posted earlier today. I took it down because I saw some potential conflicts with it that I really didn't want to come up, and I thought it'd be better just to delete it and start it over. So, anyways, if you're not familiar with me, my name is James. I am a chemist. I'm also a horticulturalist. So, I do a lot of work with chemistry. I've been teaching chemistry for years, but I've also been growing plants forever. I've got degrees in both, got bachelor's of science and chemistry on that wall and horticulture on that wall. I did do my fair time learning it in formal classrooms as well as practical work in person. But, whatever. The reason why I want to do this video is, I've been wanting to do this for a couple months now, but I kind of scrapped the original idea, and now with the Amazon burning, I feel like it's a really good opportunity to bring this back up and actually publish a video. And this has been such a big misconception. I've been wanting to talk about it for the longest time, and now that I see that Hank Green got it wrong, now mind you, he might be getting it wrong because of order of semantics. So we can argue that, oh, he didn't mean it that way. So great. If you're not familiar with Hank Green, by the way, he is a fantastic YouTuber. Please watch his videos. He's great at teaching science, and I love everything he does. I'm not dissing him in any way, shape, or form. I just think that either he could have changed the way he phrased it, or maybe he actually doesn't know this. But that's okay. We all make mistakes. That's perfectly fine. That's how you learn. That's how you develop. There is nothing wrong with that. So what is my argument? My argument is that 20% of the air you breathe, oxygen you breathe, does not come from the Amazon. Yeah, so we're told that 20% of the oxygen produced on Earth comes from the Amazon rainforest because, roughly 20% of all photosynthetic activity comes from those trees and other vegetation. And okay, great, but how much oxygen consumption comes from the rainforest? And it's also about 20%. What is typically not taught on early on sciences, and even some of the later ones, is that plants don't just produce oxygen and take in CO2 to make sugars. They also consume those sugars. They burn them just like animals do. Mind you, at a much slower rate, but they also burn most of the sugars they make. The sugars they do not burn are turned into proteins, other enzymes, other biomolecules, and especially cellulose, which makes up the cell walls of plants. Now, to make it simple, we're just going to say biomass. What they don't consume turns into biomass. So the bigger a plant, the more CO2 it's holding on to. Now, mind you, a good chunk of that weight is actually water, but it's still a lot of CO2 that's been turned into sugars, been turned into structures, and you also got proteins, enzymes, other biomolecules, etc. Okay. So that's kind of troublesome. A plant produces sugars, and then it consumes most of them. If it doesn't, bacteria eat it, other animals eat it, or it's just animals eat it, other animals eat those animals, and so forth. So it works its way through the cycle, and eventually it's all released again. So in an ecosystem like the rainforest, where it isn't getting bigger, it nets roughly 0% every year, both of oxygen and CO2. Now, mind you, it actually holds on to a little bit more CO2 because it's stored in the ground as carbonates if it doesn't fully break down. It's called mineralization. This also happens when you burn things. Look at wood ash. Wood ash is made up of carbonates, which is CO2 combined with an extra oxygen. And yeah, so for example, baking soda, sodium bicarbonate. Mix acid with it, watch it bubble. Take wood ash, mix acid with it, it bubbles. It's a carbonate. All carbonates do that. So yeah, some of it will be trapped as minerals. So yeah, it holds a little bit more than not. So I can't say it's exactly zero. Yeah, it releases a little bit more oxygen, or for sure it takes out a little bit more CO2, but it's not 20% of what you breathe in. And someone can argue semantics with that, because that 20% can mix with other things, and then effectively 20% of what I breathe is coming from the Amazon. But that's bad logic, and I don't like using it. We're just going to say, is a closed ecosystem, or closed enough. It produces and it takes it back in. It's not like exporting all the time. So the bright side is that if they don't stop burning it, we won't all die from lack of oxygen. Because that's what everyone's arguing. It's like, oh, we won't have enough oxygen to breathe. Yeah, trees aren't that much. If you haven't noticed, every YouTuber that tried to challenge where they're in a bubble with plants and they're going to see how long they can survive. And they only lasted a few hours or a day tops, because those plants aren't growing fast enough. They ain't producing enough biomass to remove enough CO2 and produce enough oxygen for that person to breathe. Your little house plant that you have sitting there, it's not an oxygen bomb as all these viral posts try telling you. If it's not getting bigger, it's basically releasing nothing, because what it releases, it reconsumes later. Conservation of mass. You learn that in like grade school science, and it's definitely applicable. Now, I'm not saying the burning is a good thing. It most definitely is not. Like, that's tragic that's happening. It's destroying biodiversity. Plants take part in something called transpiration, which is basically evaporation but coming from the leaves, and that has a huge cooling effect on the climate. Like, there's a little bit of science here, but water in the liquid form has some level of potential energy. The gaseous form has a higher potential energy level. As it goes from liquid to gas, all that energy is absorbed, and that's taking kinetic energy out of the air, which is temperature. So the temperatures drop, and it's called evaporative cooling. I'm sure you've seen evaporative cooling. You've ever seen the fan and pad cooling in greenhouses. Trees basically do the same thing, and really any vegetation. There's been some towns where they are like, oh, we want to drop water consumption. So they removed grass around houses, and they put concrete in it. Not only does concrete hold on to heat, but there's no longer transpiration from the grass, and the temperatures skyrocketed. And they had to undo that initiative, because it made it really difficult to live there. Anyways, that aside, what can we do to try to fix this problem? Now, I think one of the biggest things that's important to understand is why it's happening in the first place. It's not happening because of wildfires. We think of that here because we live in the US and we have wildfires all the time destroying our forests. Now, mind you, some of that is on purpose, because we need to have controlled burns in order to keep the ecosystem living like it has for thousands of years. But a lot of it is actually pure wildfire or man-made fires or so forth. But it just spreads, and it's not on purpose. And the rainforest, I mean, it's wet. Those fires typically don't start on their own. Yes, there are a few that have historically, but it's very rare. It's also important to note that that vegetation was never meant to undergo that kind of destruction. So they don't have as much evolutionary defenses against fire. So you don't really see them rising from the ashes quite like you see around here, which means once it's burned, you really don't get it back. So this is something we really, really, really need to think about. So why are they burning it? They're burning it predominantly because cattle is more profitable, or really agriculture in general, but cattle specifically is more profitable than having this biodiversity present. You can't really make that much money off the rainforest. You can, but you make more money if you just had thousands of head of cattle and you were selling them off. Oh boy. So what do we do? Well, the US did the exact same thing. We don't have rainforests, but we did the same thing. We've destroyed so much acreage of land, or you can say square miles or square kilometers, whatever unit you want to use. We destroyed so much in order to have pasture land and land for grain and other crops. For us to say that what they're doing is wrong isn't necessarily correct either. Now, I fully agree it shouldn't be happening. The rainforests have a much bigger impact than some of the small bits of trees we have here. Nonetheless, the trees we have here are very, very important. But we don't want it to disappear, so how do we affect this? And I think the best course of action is actually just to try to decrease meat consumption, or find some way of boosting the economics of their country in other ways so that jobs shift towards like manufacturing or towards different forms of agriculture. If you eat beef every day, for example, you could drop it down to every other day, and the amount of meat consumption has been cut in half, which will lower the overall demand. Now, mind you, that'll affect our country before it affects theirs. So that's kind of a problem too. So it's not going to be really cut and dry. The good news is with all the media attention on it, it is quite possible we get enough money flowing to that country that it can be convinced to section that land off and say, don't touch it. because it ain't going to come back once it's burned. It's done. In fact, it could easily turn into a desert considering where it's located. And I mean, we're just going to have to see how it happens. But by all means, still keep being loud about this. Keep doing what you can. Keep spreading awareness. I'm not worried about our oxygen levels. I'm definitely worried about CO2. And I'm sorry, guys. Covering the world with trees will not fix carbon dioxide. The world used to be covered with trees and had a bunch of coal and oil and natural gas stored underground. We destroyed most of those trees. We destroyed a lot of those ecosystems that kept it in balance. Or at least attempted to. And then we also released a lot of the carbon from underground. So, no, I mean, we're going down a slippery slope. It's a huge positive feedback loop. Everything's getting worse and worse. And from just so you're aware of this as well, water is a very potent greenhouse gas. And, I mean, we don't talk about it because we're not in control of it. The amount of water in the atmosphere is linked to the temperature of the Earth. Because, on hotter days, more humidity can be in the air. So the oceans will evaporate more. On colder days, less is in the air. So if CO2 levels, for example, rise, or other things like SO3, NO2, etc., any of these gases show up, methane and so forth, in our atmosphere, if the temperature rises a little bit, a lot more water will evaporate. And when a lot more water evaporates, it gets hotter, which means more water evaporates, which means it gets hotter. And eventually it'll plateau somewhere, but it'll keep rising. You got the ice sheets that are melting, and that reflects all light back out into space. It's a positive feedback loop. Yes, we definitely should be talking about this. We need to talk about ways of reducing our impact on the Earth. But in the grand scheme of things, and this shows you how much damage we've done, even if we somehow preserve the entirety of the rainforest and reforested the Earth, we are still screwed. I apologize for that little break. I got a phone call and it completely ruined my recording. But anyways, so no matter how you look at this, we're basically screwed and we're just waiting for humanity to wipe itself out. But I do have some ideas, and so do a lot of other people who are definitely more qualified and smarter than me. And honestly, if we all start working together, we can probably make a change. Yes, we should start planting things like trees and so forth that have long-term growth that holds on to the carbon for long periods of time. We should look to producing biofuels, which is more carbon neutral. We could grow things like bamboo that grow very quickly and use it in place of coal. Won't burn as well as coal, but the ashes can be stored, and honestly, it is carbon neutral. But when you store the ashes, you are taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. Chemists need more funding so they can try finding catalysts that can turn CO2 into useful materials. And there's a lot that can be done, but if we don't start now, it will be too late. So no, the Amazon isn't really our answer, but it's definitely making the situation worse. But just because it's just going to even if it gets destroyed, it doesn't really mean the end of the world. We keep throwing that narrative out there. It's not the end of the world, but it's definitely going to make the situation much, 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 much worse. If you'd like to open up some discussion, please do so in the comments. Anytime you leave a comment, it tells YouTube algorithm that this is a video worth talking about and sends it to more people. And if you got nothing to say, by all means, leave a like, or a dislike if you don't like it, but please tell me why you don't like it. But by all means, leave a like, leave a comment, and that helps out the channel, helps it grow, but also allows me to know what you're thinking so I can get involved with that discussion. Y'all have a great evening.